All right, we're gonna look at some more properties of quadrilaterals. Last time we looked at the rhombus, and before that it was the parallelogram. So we've got parallelogram, rhombus, and today we're gonna look at the rectangle and square. And we're gonna look at those two together because they're actually very similar in properties. Okay, so we're gonna be on page 97 here. 97, we've got properties of rectangle and square. Okay, now they do have separate properties, but they have some overlapping that we'll talk about. So a rectangle is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel and 4 right angles. Okay, so really a rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. So note here, properties of parallelogram apply. Okay, but a rectangle is not a rhombus. Okay, a rhombus has 4 congruent sides. A rectangle will not have 4 congruent sides. So both a rhombus and a rectangle are parallelograms, but then they kind of branch down and are 2 separate things. A square Okay, a square is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. It has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. Okay, so the opposite sides being parallel, that makes it a parallelogram. The 4 right angles makes it a rectangle, and the 4 congruent sides makes it a rhombus. So actually, we're going to note here that properties of parallelogram, rhombus, and rectangle all apply. Okay, so a square is actually a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, a rhombus, and a rectangle. It is all of those things. Okay, so we only have 2 properties here, or 2 theorems that we're going to talk about. Number 1 is that a parallelogram is a rectangle if and only if its diagonals are congruent. Okay, so picture-wise, if I draw a rectangle here, and that's a parallelogram, and it is a rectangle if you have these two diagonals, and those diagonals are the same length. Okay. Now with the parallelogram, the diagonals actually bisected each other. So these will also bisect each other. So every single half of the diagonal will be the same length. But this whole diagonal and this whole diagonal will be congruent to each other, the same length. Okay, and the second one here, number 2, a parallelogram is a square if and only if it's a rhombus and a rectangle. Which is kind of what we said up here in the definition. Okay. A quadrilateral with 4 right angles is a rectangle. Quadrilateral with 4 congruent sides is a rhombus. And then the opposite side's parallel, that's a parallelogram. So it has to be a parallelogram, rectangle, and a rhombus. Okay, it's got to be all of that. So I just have kind of a different type of example here with this section. Okay, and we're just going to classify the parallelogram. Okay, so we got A, A, and then here is B. Okay, now with these types of problems, we've talked about this before, you can't go off of looks. Okay, they're going to try to get you to go off of looks, but you can't. You have to go off of the notation that is actually given. Okay, so let's start with A, and let's just kind of go down the list that we have. We know that it has 4 sides, so it's at least a quadrilateral. Okay, and they actually tell us it's a parallelogram, but we know from here that it's a parallelogram because you got opposite sides congruent. Okay, so if this is a parallelogram, they give me that it's got 4 right angles. And the only thing that is a parallelogram and has 4 right angles is a rectangle. Now, looking at it, they want you to believe that it is a square because they kind of made the sides look the same length. But it is not, because they don't tell us that the sides are the same. They do tell us that that you have 4 right angles. So it is a rectangle. Okay. All right. So here again, we have a parallelogram. So if we have a parallelogram, we either have a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. Okay, one of those 3. Now with a rhombus, all sides are going to be the same. Yeah. So I got all sides are the same. But it could also be a square because a square has all sides the same. Okay, but right here it says if it's a square, it's a rhombus and a rectangle. So let's see if this thing could be a rectangle. Well, with a rectangle here, it says a parallelogram is a rectangle if and only if its diagonals are congruent. Remember, I noted that all those are congruent. And if we look at this picture here, I've got all of those lengths are the same. So this is actually a rectangle too. Okay, even though they didn't note the 4 right angles, they noted it here instead. On this one, they didn't note the diagonals, they noted the 4 right angles. So this is a rhombus and a rectangle. Okay, so it is actually a square. Okay, we might want to say that this one was a rectangle because 4 right angles, and this one was a square because rhombus and rectangle. We're not going to get into a lot of the proofs. The proofs is in the honors class, but we do need to be able to justify our reasoning just a little bit. All right, that is it for the rectangles and squares property. I will put on Canvas a practice, some practice problems for you on rectangle and rhombus. Make sure you're doing those practice problems for the quiz because they'll give you some good practice to help you out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. See you in the next lesson.